What's up, Thrashers, and welcome back once again to the Thrash Maniac 99 YouTube channel, and I am back for yet another response video to a new thread that was started up actually earlier today whenever this video is posted, and that is from my good friend and co-host of the Horsemen Podcast, Horror Master, aka Ricky, who has just been starting to make YouTube videos as of late, and he's been doing a solid job. I will have a link in the description box for Ricky's YouTube channel for you guys to check out. He started this new thread. Now, granted, I'm tweaking it just a little bit here for everybody else because while his original video was cool, I didn't want to have anything outside of metal, hence why this is 10 metal bands for horror fans. I didn't include hard rock or shock rock or punk bands on this list because honestly I feel like this list would get way too saturated with those kind of bands. So that's why you will not see Kiss, Alice Cooper, Murder Dolls, Misfits on this list. Sorry guys. I wanted to focus primarily on the metal side of things. And I figured 10 metal bands for horror fans. There are quite a lot of metal bands that have horror themes in their music, or at least have elements of that, whether it's in the lyrics or just in the music. It feels like it would belong in a horror movie or something like that. So I encourage everybody who's watching this video that has a YouTube channel and makes videos to make videos about this, because I'd be curious to hear other people's picks for horror fans, metal bands for horror fans. So why don't we get started with one of the progenitors of this, and that is GWAR. Of course, most of us metalheads should know about the band GWAR, and if you don't, how the hell are you here? But GWAR, of course, formed in the mid-'80s out of Richmond, Virginia, and of course, combo of hardcore, thrash, little bit of groove, kind of mashed together. And while a lot of their stuff is pretty humorous, like dealing with sex and drugs and rock and roll and stuff, but there is a horror element to the aesthetic, like the costumes and the stage names. One of the first bands to really kind of embrace the costume look and the like goofy yet horrific stage names, so on and so forth. I mean, albums like Scumdogs of the Universe are very essential for horror fans given the content and the aesthetic of the band. And despite Dave Brockie no longer being with us, may he rest in peace, band is still going strong to this day and still pumping out some solid material. So if I was a horror fan and I'm looking for a metal band to start getting into at first that has elements of what I see in horror movies, GWAR would be a good band to kind of start things off on a bit of a more humorous note, of course, but them baby steps you gotta take to get to the rest of these bands. Following GWAR, let's talk about King Diamond. So yeah, King Diamond, in my opinion, one of the top 5 greatest vocalists in the history of heavy metal, up there with Bruce Dickinson and Rob Halford and Ronnie James Dio. Like, he is in that upper echelon of metal vocalists to me. I could have said Merciful Fate, but I wanted to focus primarily on his solo band, considering Merciful Fate was more occult themed and so on and so forth, whereas here with King Diamond it's more horror stories, like conceptual stories of horror, like of course the classics Abigail and Them. Those are 2 great albums that definitely feel like they would belong in a horror movie, especially Abigail. The song itself, Abigail, would be like the perfect song for, say, like a movie where the final girl is like at a prom or something like that, kind of like Prom Night or Carrie or something along those lines. But of course, like musically, it has an eerie, creepy atmosphere on top of it, but the music's still incredibly heavy, kind of proggy at times. It gets proggy here and there with King Diamond's solo stuff. And of course, King Diamond's voice. I mean, that ghostly, howling falsetto he has, that would be enough to freak a lot of normal folks up. Or freak them out, not up, freak them out. I gotta get my words straight on this. But anyways, yeah, King Diamond, I would say, would be another great band or vocalist that would definitely hit you in the feels of being a horror fan. Following King Diamond, next band I'm going to talk about is Slayer. I mean, that's all I gotta say. Slayer. Nah, I'm just kidding. Of course, Slayer, one of the founding fathers of the American thrash metal scene, along with Overkill, Exodus, Metallica, and of course, Slayer being one of the more influential thrash metal bands. And whenever you read into the lyrics, yeah, it's like early on it was more about the occult and satanic stuff, but then starting from a couple of tracks on like Hell Awaits all the way through to the end of their career, they began to incorporate more horror-based stuff, whether it be from stories or real-life horror like war and torture and stuff like that. Primary song that I think would get a horror fan like really into Slayer would be Dead Skin Mask off of Seasons in the Abyss. That, to me, if I were to have made a top 10 list of horror songs for metal, Dead Skin Mask would be near the top of that list because it is so creepy, it is melodic, yet super heavy and evil sounding. Of course, there's a lot of Slayer songs that fit the horror mold. Tracks like Raining Blood, Angel of Death, and that's real life horror right there. Not going to get into it. Songs like Hell Awaits would be in there, Crypts of Eternity, At Dawn They Sleep, Altar of Sacrifice, Criminally Insane, Spill the Blood. There's a bunch of songs from Slayer that would probably hook a horror fan into the music. So I would say Slayer would be a big choice for a horror fan to get into metal, would be through Slayer. Following Slayer, let's get into Mayhem. Of course, Mayhem, arguably the most controversial band in the history of music, let alone metal, because of all the church burnings from back in the early 90s in Norway, and the suicide of their former vocalist Per Dead Olin, the murder of Euronymous by Var Vikernes, among all that stuff. But of course, when I'm talking musically, yeah, they're the founding fathers of the Norwegian black metal scene, and lyrically speaking, like, yeah, it delves into the occult and in death, but whenever you read, especially the lyrics on the album De Mysteriis Dom Satanis, there's a lot of stuff that would feel like it'd be perfect for a horror movie. Tracks like Freezing Moon, Curse to Eternity, Life Eternal, Buried by Time and Dust. And then even throughout the later albums, they still have a little horror aspect to their sound, especially on the album Chimera, with songs like My Death, for example, feels something directly lifted out of horror and gore and brutality and so on and so forth. So in terms of horror fans that would like to get into like black metal, I'd say Mayhem would be a good first start for that kind of style. So yeah, I would recommend Mayhem to a horror fan. So we've gone through GWAR, King Diamond, Slayer, and Mayhem, so that's 4. Now the next 2 are going to be 2 essential ones in death metal as well as a little bit of grindcore. And the first one I'm going to talk about is Impetigo. Of course, Impetigo was a band that formed in the late 80s out of Chicago, or suburban Chicago, and they were seen as one of the pioneers of what became known as gore grind. Even though they were still very much death metal, it was definitely more on the punky side of death metal and led to the gore grind genre coming about. Granted, Carcass created gore grind with Reek of Putrefaction, but Impetigo kind of took the influence of Carcass, of early Carcass, like the first Carcass album, but made it punkier and a little more humorous, so it kind of fits a little bit in line with GWAR in terms of the humor and the tongue-in-cheek aspect. But the reason why Impetigo would be a huge gateway for a horror fan to get into metal, they were the first ones to start using horror movie samples on their tracks. I mean, you listen to their 2 albums, Ultimo Mondo Cannibale and Horror of the Zombies. Those 2 albums have so many horror movie samples, and musically speaking, it's gross and disgusting and raw and dirty sounding. Like I said, the first album, Ultimo Mondo Cannibale, very much punky and the vocals are kind of all over the place, from like really loud screams and like pitch shifted growls and like mid-range gurgles, while musically speaking, yeah, it's very punky. Horror of the Zombies was when they kind of refined their sound into being more straight up death metal with grind elements, and the vocal performance was a lot better, no need to use pitch shifters. And it was more mature, yet still goofy with the lyrical content and the horror movie samples they used. But they were very important in terms of death metal and grindcore and gore grind and extreme flavors of all sorts. And then the next band in a similar vein, although a pioneer arguably in what became known as brutal death metal, Mortician. Of course, Mortician formed in the late 80s out of Yonkers, New York, and kind of followed in the shadow at first of Impetigo, because Impetigo was a huge inspiration on Mortician. But what Mortician did that was different from Impetigo was Mortician made the music more brutal, way heavier, dirtier bass tone. And while they both bands used horror movie samples, Mortician would actually do albums based on films, or EPs based on films. Primarily the Texas Chainsaw Massacre franchise they focused primarily on with their lyrical content on a lot of tracks. Some albums that I would recommend from Mortician for a horror fan would be the Zombie Apocalypse EP, House by the Cemetery EP, Mortal Massacre, their first album, Hacked Up for Barbecue, Chainsaw Dismemberment, their second album, pretty much their 90s catalog, from Mortal Massacre or Brutally Mutilated through Chainsaw Dismemberment, I would recommend for a horror fan. The 2000s material, you can kind of skip the 2000s material, because I'll be honest, they are not really that great. But their 90s work is top-notch, brutal death metal with some grind elements, and even a little industrial metal too, because the drum machine, they were also a pioneer of using drum machines in their music just so they could push the speeds to insane levels and just make the guitars sound dirty. The bass, arguably the heaviest bass tone of any band out there, and they took that inspiration from the band Repulsion because they pioneered that dirty, grinding bass sound. So you pretty much get the grindy blast beats and bass with death metal guitars and vocals. And the vocals, the lowest gurgles you will ever hear, from courtesy of the man himself, Will Romer. So that takes care of those bands. Next up, I'm going to be talking about the most famous death metal band of all time, and that is, of course, Cannibal Corpse. If you're going to have a list of metal bands for horror fans, you can't not include Cannibal Corpse. Cannibal Corpse, I mean, their album covers are legendary for the most part. Like, most of their album covers are fucking fantastic, gory paintings, like comics. After all, it's Vincent Locke who does horror comics, who does the album work for Cannibal Corpse. Of course, their covers on, like, Eaten Back to Life, Butchered at Birth, Tomb of the Mutilated, Gallery of Suicide, Wretched Spawn. Those are, in my opinion, the best album covers that Cannibal Corpse ever had. And of course, musically speaking, it's downright heavy and nasty, lots of grooves, hooks, some technicality. And then lyrically speaking, I mean, pioneering gore lyrics like horror gore, like tracks like A Skull Full of Maggots, Hammer Smashed Face, Fucked with a Knife, Staring Through the Eyes of the Dead, Orgasm Through Torture. I can go on and on about Cannibal Corpse and why they are essential for a horror fan to get into metal. Like, Cannibal Corpse, definitely a big one to get you into the genre. Next up, I'm going to be talking about Cradle of Filth. Now, Cradle of Filth, I'll be honest, I've never been the biggest fan of Cradle of Filth, but I absolutely respect and I do like some of their stuff. And I think Cradle of Filth is a perfect meeting ground of metal and horror, because if you read Danny Filth's lyrics, yeah, they also take gothic imagery and also archaic poetry, but it also takes a lot of influence from old horror movies, kind of like combining horror and gothic imagery mash it together with the music being like a combination of black metal, gothic metal, death metal, and symphonic metal kind of mashed together. It's definitely more gothic and symphonic with some black metal and death metal vocals on top. But I mean, they are a big gateway for a horror fan to get into metal, I would say. Especially the ladies, considering Cradle of Filth's fan base is, I think, like at this point, 60% female at this point. Considering, you know, they got female vocals, and of course, Danny Filth, he's a handsome fella, so there you go. But yeah, I would say Cradle of Filth would be an important one to get you into the genre, for sure. Damn ladybugs. The second to last band that I'm going to talk about is going to be another one in the black metal realm, and that's Kark on Grin. And the reason why I picked them is because, yeah, they are a symphonic black metal band out of the Netherlands that formed in 2003. But again, aesthetic-wise and lyrical content, all about horror stories and horror legends and monsters and stuff. And they even call themselves horror metal. And what separates them from all the other symphonic black metal bands is the fact that they don't focus on satanic, occult-themed lyrics. They focus on gore and death and horror, storytelling, and despite a couple albums kind of being they've been a very consistent band going to this very day. And I would recommend, especially also if you're looking to get into more bombastic metal music with a horror theme, I'd say Kark on Grin would be a very good pick. Kind of almost like a continuation of what Cradle of Filth, but also what Dimmu Borgir did, but just make it a little heavier and a little more gross sounding. But yeah, Kark on Grin would be another great choice. And then for my final pick of a metal band for a horror fan, Hooded Menace. Because Hooded Menace, when you listen to that guitar tone of Hooded Menace, it feels evil, it feels creepy and scary sounding. And of course, when you read the lyrics, again, similar to Kark on Grin, horror stories, whether it be from films or real life horror murderers like Jeffrey Dahmer or whoever along those lines. But yeah, mostly horror stories from books and film. Hell, the song Never Cross the Dead, based off of, I'm trying to remember, Tomb of the Blind Dead, which was a Spanish horror movie in the early 70s. And again, that whole album, Never Cross the Dead, feels like a concept album for the Blind Dead movie franchise of the early 70s. But musically speaking, it's death doom. It's slow death metal that borders on doom metal a lot of times. Kind of like a mixture of Candlemass and Black Sabbath as far as the doom influence, but combining influence from bands like Autopsy, Asphyx, early Paradise Lost, mash it together into their, and a little bit of Entombed and bands along those lines, like a little bit of Swedish death metal, Asphyx and Autopsy and early Paradise Lost, mashed with, shut up phone, mashed with Candlemass and Black Sabbath, and you get Hooded Menace. And I recommend you guys who are horror fans check out Hooded Menace, because I think it'll be right up your alley. But those are my 10 metal bands for horror fans. Ricky, this is a really cool thread that you're starting here. Granted, I tweaked it to where it's just metal and not punk and shock rock and hard rock, because I wanted to focus on some more underground choices here. But like I said, I'll have a link for Ricky's channel in the description below. And for those of you who are watching that make videos, I would love to see you guys respond to this, because I want to hear other people's choices on which metal bands you think would hook a horror fan into metal music. But anyways, thank you guys for watching this, and until next time, horns high, and I will see you in the next one. So, as far as the album itself goes, I mean, this is a forgotten album within the world of death metal, and we're going to go into why song by song. So, quick little 45-second introduction. I can never pronounce this right. Borivho's Demise. If somebody can tell me how the hell do you pronounce that, please tell me. Fun little groovy 45-second introduction track into the real opener, Incinerated, which just comes in straight out of nowhere with grindy blast beats and grindcore-esque riffing before it just goes into some great meat and potatoes.